The ordinary day. On a bright, sunny afternoon, the small town of Maplewood buzzed with life. Children played in the park, laughter filling the air. A young girl named Aisha was among them. She was 10 years old, with big, curious eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest day. Aisha loved exploring the park, where the trees danced in the breeze and colorful flowers bloomed all around. As she skipped along the path, Aisha spotted an elderly woman sitting on a bench. The woman, Mrs. Thompson, had silver hair tied in a neat bun and wore a soft blue sweater that looked cozy. Aisha had seen her in the park many times before. Mrs. Thompson was known for her warm smile and kind words. She always shared stories about her life when Aisha would stop to chat. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson," Aisha called out, waving her hand. The elderly woman looked up, her eyes twinkling with joy. "Hello, dear. It's good to see you," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice gentle like the morning sun. Aisha ran over to the bench, excited to hear one of Mrs. Thompson's stories. The woman began to tell her about the time she traveled to the beach when she was a little girl. Aisha listened intently, picturing the golden sand and the waves crashing on the shore. Just then, Aisha noticed something strange. A large red car was speeding down the street, much faster than any car should go. The driver seemed distracted, not paying attention to the road. Aisha's heart raced as she watched the car come closer to the park. "Mrs. Thompson, look out," Aisha shouted, her voice full of panic. Mrs. Thompson turned, but it was too late. The car swerved and hit her grocery cart, sending it flying into the air. Aisha gasped as the car came to a sudden stop. But the worst part was that Mrs. Thompson fell, and the car rolled forward, trapping her underneath. Aisha froze for a moment, her heart pounding. She felt a mix of fear and determination. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. "I have to help her," she thought, shaking off her shock. Without thinking, Aisha ran towards the car. The world around her faded away. All she could focus on was Mrs. Thompson, who lay on the ground, struggling to breathe. The crowd around them was beginning to gather, but Aisha felt like she was in a bubble, isolated from everything else. When she reached the car, Aisha could see Mrs. Thompson's face. It was pale, and she looked scared. "Hold on, Mrs. Thompson. I'm coming," Aisha shouted, though she wasn't sure how she could help. The car was heavy, and Aisha was just a small girl. She glanced around, hoping someone would help. But people were either calling for help or staring in shock. Aisha knew she couldn't wait. She had to act now. Aisha took a deep breath and knelt down. She pressed her hands against the side of the car. "I can do this," she whispered to herself. She remembered the lessons she had learned in school about staying calm in emergencies. With all her strength, she pushed against the car. At first, nothing happened. The car didn't budge. Aisha felt tears welling in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "I can't give up," she told herself. She remembered how Mrs. Thompson always encouraged her to be brave and to believe in herself. Just then, a loud voice broke through the crowd. What happened here? A strong man rushed forward, pushing through the onlookers. It was Mr. Johnson, a local firefighter. He had been nearby and heard the commotion. "A car hit Mrs. Thompson. She's trapped," Aisha cried, pointing at the car. She felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized help had arrived. Mr. Johnson knelt down beside Aisha, his expression serious but kind. "You did well to try and lift the car, Aisha, but we need more help. Stay here and keep talking to Mrs. Thompson," he said, looking at the elderly woman with concern. Aisha nodded, trying to remain strong. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm here. Help is coming," she assured her, holding the woman's hand tightly. She could see that Mrs. Thompson was scared, and Aisha wanted to comfort her. More people started to gather, and soon a group of men joined Mr. Johnson. They began to assess the situation, talking quickly about how they would lift the car. Aisha watched, her heart still racing. She felt small, but she was determined to stay close to Mrs. Thompson. The crowd murmured, some people gasping at the sight of the car on top of the elderly woman. Aisha could feel their eyes on her, but she focused on Mrs. Thompson. She kept talking, sharing stories, and encouraging words, hoping to keep her calm. "Remember the beach story you told me?" Aisha said, trying to bring a smile to Mrs. Thompson's face. "I want to hear more about it when you get better." Suddenly, Aisha heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The ambulance was on its way, and she felt a glimmer of hope. She looked up at the sky, thanking the universe for sending help. As the ambulance pulled up, Aisha realized that she was about to witness something incredible. She had never been in such a situation before, but she knew one thing. She would do everything she could to help Mrs. Thompson. The sirens echoed in the background, blending with the shouts and cries of the crowd. Aisha felt a mix of fear and excitement. This ordinary day had turned into something extraordinary, and she was at the heart of it all. She just hoped that everything would turn out all right in the end. As the medics rushed forward, Aisha felt a new sense of determination. She had faced something terrifying, but she knew she could help. And no matter what happened next, she was ready to stand by Mrs. Thompson's side. The heroic moment. Aisha's heart raced as the medics jumped out of the ambulance, rushing toward the scene. The sirens faded, replaced by the urgent voices of the paramedics as they assessed the situation. Aisha felt a mix of hope and fear. Would they be able to save Mrs. Thompson? Would she be okay? "Stay back, everyone," one of the paramedics called out, waving his arms. "We need space to work." The crowd stepped back, but Aisha remained close, determined not to leave Mrs. Thompson's side. The paramedics moved quickly, their movements confident and practiced. Aisha watched as they crouched down next to Mrs. Thompson, checking her vitals and asking her questions. "Can you hear me, ma'am? What's your name?" one of them asked gently. Mrs. Thompson struggled to answer, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Thompson," she managed to say, her face pale and strained. Aisha squeezed her hand tighter, trying to provide comfort. "You're going to be okay, Mrs. Thompson. They're here to help you." Suddenly, one of the paramedics turned to Aisha. "You did a great job, young lady," he said, his voice full of praise. "But we need to get her out from under the car. Can you help us?" Aisha nodded, her determination swelling inside her. "What do you need me to do?" The paramedic pointed to the side of the car. "We're going to use a jack to lift the car, but we need you to keep Mrs. Thompson calm. Talk to her and let her know she's safe." Aisha felt a surge of responsibility wash over her. She took a deep breath and turned to Mrs. Thompson, who looked frightened and vulnerable. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm here with you," Aisha said softly. "You're safe now. They're going to lift the car off you. Just focus on my voice." The paramedics quickly positioned a hydraulic jack under the car, adjusting it carefully. Aisha could see their faces were serious as they prepared to lift the heavy vehicle. Her heart thudded in her chest. She had never felt such fear and excitement at the same time. "On the count of 3, we're going to lift the car, okay?" the lead paramedic said. He looked at Aisha, who nodded, trying to look brave. 1, 2, 3. With a loud, straining sound, the car began to rise. Aisha watched in awe as the vehicle lifted slightly, the weight shifting. Mrs. Thompson winced, and Aisha leaned closer, ready to support her. "Just a little more, Mrs. Thompson. You're doing great," she encouraged. The crowd gasped, and Aisha felt their eyes on her, but she stayed focused. She could see the determination in the paramedics' faces as they continued to lift the car, their muscles straining with effort. "Keep talking to her, Aisha," one of the paramedics called out. "She needs to hear you." Aisha took a deep breath. "Mrs. Thompson, remember that time you told me about your trip to the beach? The sand and the waves. What was your favorite part?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered, and Aisha could see her trying to focus on the memories. "The seagulls. They danced in the sky," she replied, her voice faint but clear. Yes, they did. And remember how you built that big sandcastle? Aisha said, her voice filled with excitement. You told me it was the tallest one on the beach. As the paramedics continued to lift the car, Aisha kept the conversation going, her words flowing like a stream. She could see Mrs. Thompson's face relaxing a little, the tension easing as she pictured the beach. Almost there, the lead paramedic shouted. Just a few more inches. Aisha felt a surge of hope as she watched the car rise higher. Suddenly, there was a loud crunching noise as the car finally shifted. Aisha's heart leaped as she saw a gap open up beneath the vehicle. Now, the paramedics shouted. They quickly slid a sturdy board under Mrs. Thompson, creating a stable surface to help lift her out. Hold on, Mrs. Thompson, Aisha said, her voice steady. You're almost free. With a final push, the paramedics lifted the car just enough for Mrs. Thompson to be pulled out safely. As they slid her onto the board, Aisha could see that Mrs. Thompson was weak but conscious. Thank you, Aisha, Mrs. Thompson whispered, her eyes filled with gratitude. You were so brave. Tears welled in Aisha's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. I was just doing what you taught me, Mrs. Thompson. You always told me to help others, she said, feeling a swell of pride. As they wheeled Mrs. Thompson away on a stretcher, Aisha felt a mixture of relief and fear. The paramedics worked quickly, placing her in the ambulance. Aisha stood nearby, her heart pounding, knowing that the situation was still serious. Before the doors closed, Mrs. Thompson looked at Aisha with a soft smile. I'll be okay because you were there, she said, her voice filled with warmth. You have a kind heart, my dear. The ambulance pulled away with its lights flashing and sirens wailing, leaving Aisha standing in the park, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. She felt proud of what she had done, but also worried for Mrs. Thompson. As the crowd began to disperse, Aisha took a deep breath. She had never faced anything like this before, but she knew one thing. She had done her best to help. Even in the chaos, Aisha felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She wanted to learn more about helping others, to be prepared for anything. Little did she know, this moment would change her life forever. With a heavy heart but a fierce spirit, Aisha turned away from the park, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. She couldn't wait to see Mrs. Thompson again, and to hear more stories about the brave woman she admired so much. Aisha knew that this ordinary day had turned into something extraordinary, and it was just the beginning of her journey. A new beginning. The sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood as Aisha walked home. Her mind was still racing with thoughts of the day's events. She had never imagined that a simple visit to the park would turn into a life-changing moment for both her and Mrs. Thompson. Each step felt heavy as she replayed the scene in her mind. The sirens, the paramedics, and most importantly, Mrs. Thompson's grateful smile. When Aisha arrived home, she found her mother in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. The comforting smell of spices filled the air, a familiar scent that always made her feel safe. Aisha's mother turned and noticed the look on her daughter's face. Aisha, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost, her mother said, concern etching her features. It's Mrs. Thompson, Aisha stammered, her voice shaky. She was trapped under a car. I helped save her. Her mother dropped the spoon, her eyes widening in disbelief. Oh my goodness. Are you okay? Did you get hurt? I'm fine, Aisha replied quickly, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. But Mrs. Thompson, she was in so much pain. The paramedics took her to the hospital. Her mother rushed to Aisha and pulled her into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you for being brave and helping her. That's incredible, Aisha. Aisha hugged her back, comforted by her mother's warmth. But what if she doesn't get better? What if she's really hurt? Her mother pulled away, looking directly into Aisha's eyes. You did everything you could. You stayed calm and helped until the professionals arrived. That's what matters. You showed kindness and courage. No matter what happens next, you should be proud of yourself. Aisha felt a flicker of hope at her mother's words. She took a deep breath and tried to focus on the positive. I just want to see her again. I hope she's okay. I'm sure she will be. Why don't we bake some cookies tomorrow and take them to the hospital? It might cheer her up, her mother suggested, her eyes brightening at the idea. Aisha smiled at the thought. That's a great idea. Mrs. Thompson loves chocolate chip cookies. As they made plans, Aisha felt a sense of purpose wash over her. She wanted to do more than just help once. She wanted to be there for Mrs. Thompson through her recovery. She decided then and there that she would visit her at the hospital, no matter what it took. The next day, Aisha woke up with renewed energy. She helped her mother bake a batch of warm, gooey chocolate chip cookies, the smell filling their home with sweetness. They carefully packed the cookies in a colorful box, and Aisha could barely contain her excitement. Are you ready? Her mother asked as they headed out the door, the cookie box in hand. Yes, let's go, Aisha replied, her heart racing with anticipation. The drive to the hospital was filled with nervous chatter. Aisha's mind buzzed with questions. Would Mrs. Thompson remember her? Would she be happy to see her? Aisha hoped that the cookies would bring a smile to her face. When they arrived at the hospital, Aisha felt a mix of emotions. Nervousness and hope swirled inside her. They walked through the bright, sterile hallways, the sounds of beeping machines and busy nurses filling the air. Aisha followed her mother as they made their way to the room where Mrs. Thompson was staying. As they approached the door, Aisha's heart raced. She took a deep breath and pushed it open. The sight of Mrs. Thompson lying in the hospital bed made her heart sink. Mrs. Thompson looked fragile, with bandages on her arms and a worried expression on her face. Mrs. Thompson, Aisha called out, rushing to her side. I brought you cookies. Mrs. Thompson's face lit up at the sight of Aisha. Oh, dear girl, it's so good to see you, she exclaimed, her voice warm but weak. Aisha placed the cookie box on the bedside table and sat down beside her. I was so worried about you. I can't believe what happened. Mrs. Thompson smiled softly. You were so brave, Aisha. I'll never forget what you did for me. You kept me calm, and that made all the difference. Aisha's cheeks flushed with pride. I just did what you taught me. Help others when they need it, she said, feeling a swell of happiness. How are you feeling? I'm on the mend, thanks to you and the wonderful paramedics. I had a rough night, but I'm getting better, Mrs. Thompson replied. And these cookies will help too. Aisha grinned, watching as Mrs. Thompson took a cookie from the box. You have to promise to eat all of them, she teased. I'll do my best, Aisha, Mrs. Thompson laughed, her voice sounding stronger. You know, this moment has changed my life, just as much as it has changed yours. You have a heart of gold, and I want to encourage you to continue helping others. Aisha felt a warmth spreading in her chest. I want to help. I want to learn more about being a hero like you. Mrs. Thompson's eyes sparkled with pride. You already are a hero, dear. Just keep being you. As Aisha and Mrs. Thompson chatted, the worries that had clouded Aisha's mind began to lift. She felt inspired and determined to make a difference, not just for Mrs. Thompson, but for others too. In that hospital room, Aisha realized that her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. She wanted to be brave, to help those in need, and to learn everything she could about making a positive impact in her community. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of her journey, a journey that would lead her to discover not only her own strength, but the power of kindness and compassion in the world around her. A spark of inspiration. Aisha left the hospital with a heart full of joy. She felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Spending time with Mrs. Thompson had opened her eyes to a new world of possibilities. She realized that helping others was more than just a one-time act. It was a way of life. The next day, Aisha woke up early, the sun barely rising over the horizon. She lay in bed, thinking about her visit to the hospital. The image of Mrs. Thompson smiling and enjoying the cookies lingered in her mind. Aisha decided she wanted to do more. She wanted to make a difference not just for Mrs. Thompson, but for others in her community as well. After breakfast, Aisha gathered her thoughts and made a plan. She grabbed a notebook and wrote at the top, Aisha's acts of kindness. Underneath, she listed ideas for how she could help others. Visit the elderly in her neighborhood who might feel lonely. Organize a community cleanup to make the park a nicer place for everyone. Start a reading group at her school for younger kids. As she scribbled down her ideas, Aisha felt a rush of excitement. Each idea represented a chance to connect with others, to show them that someone cared. She knew she couldn't do it all at once, but she was determined to start small. That afternoon, Aisha decided to visit her friend Jamal. He lived just a few blocks away, and they often played together after school. When she arrived, she found him in his backyard, tossing a basketball into the hoop. "Hey, Aisha, want to shoot some hoops?" Jamal called out, grinning widely. Aisha waved and walked over. "Not right now, Jamal. I have something important to talk to you about." He stopped and leaned against the hoop, looking curious. "What's up?" "I want to do something special to help people in our neighborhood," Aisha said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Like visiting the elderly or cleaning up the park. Do you want to help me?" Jamal's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Wow, that's a great idea. I'm in. What do we do first?" Aisha thought for a moment. "How about we start by visiting Mrs. Thompson again? She could probably use some company, and we can see if there's anything she needs." "Good idea. Let's go," Jamal exclaimed, and the two friends quickly set off for the hospital. When they arrived, Aisha felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Would Mrs. Thompson be happy to see them again? As they walked into her room, Aisha took a deep breath and smiled brightly. "Mrs. Thompson, we're back," Aisha announced cheerfully. Mrs. Thompson looked up, her eyes lighting up with joy. "Aisha, Jamal, how wonderful to see you both." She gestured for them to come closer. "What brings you here today?" "We wanted to check on you and see if you need anything," Aisha said, her voice warm and inviting. "We brought some games and books to keep you company." "Oh, how lovely. I would love some company and a good game," Mrs. Thompson replied, her smile spreading wider. "What do you have?" Aisha and Jamal pulled out a deck of cards and some board games they had brought along. They set them up on the small table next to her bed. The laughter and chatter filled the room as they played games, and Mrs. Thompson shared stories from her youth. Aisha listened intently, captivated by Mrs. Thompson's tales of adventures and challenges. The elderly woman's spirit was infectious, and Aisha found herself feeling even more inspired. As they played, Aisha noticed how Mrs. Thompson's face lit up with every story. It made her realize how important it was to connect with others. Sometimes, all someone needed was a friendly smile and a listening ear. After a few games, Aisha asked, "Mrs. Thompson, do you think we could organize a game day for the other residents in your building? It could be fun for everyone." Mrs. Thompson clapped her hands together, her eyes sparkling. "What a wonderful idea. I'm sure many of them would love it. We could have a fun afternoon with games and snacks. I can help you plan it." Excitement bubbled in Aisha's chest. "Yes, let's do it. This will be the first of many acts of kindness we do." After spending the afternoon with Mrs. Thompson, Aisha and Jamal left the hospital feeling fulfilled. Aisha couldn't help but think about how she was starting to create a ripple effect in her community. By showing kindness to one person, they were now inspiring joy for many more. The next day, Aisha and Jamal made flyers to announce their game day at the elderly home. They wrote about the date, time, and details, and even included a little note inviting everyone to bring their favorite game. "Ready to spread the word?" Jamal asked, holding a stack of flyers in his hands. "Absolutely. Let's go," Aisha replied, her heart racing with excitement. They set out to hang the flyers in local stores, community centers, and anywhere they could think of. Aisha felt a sense of purpose with every flyer they posted. She imagined all the smiling faces of the elderly playing games, laughing and enjoying each other's company. As they walked, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that they were starting something special. This was just the beginning. She was determined to make a difference, one act of kindness at a time. With her heart full of hope and her mind racing with ideas, Aisha knew she was on the path to becoming the person she always wanted to be, a true hero in her community. And in that moment, she felt a spark of inspiration that would light her way forward. The game day. The day of the game event finally arrived. Aisha woke up early, her excitement bubbling inside her. She had been planning for weeks, and now it was time to see everything come together. After breakfast, she quickly dressed in her favorite t-shirt and jeans, grabbed her backpack, and headed to meet Jamal. As Aisha walked down the street, she felt a mix of nerves and joy. Would everyone enjoy the games? Would the elderly residents come? Her mind raced with thoughts, but she pushed them aside. Today was about bringing smiles to others. When Aisha arrived at Jamal's house, he was already waiting for her, bouncing on his feet. "Are you ready?" he asked, his face bright with enthusiasm. "Ready as ever," Aisha replied. "Let's go set everything up." They made their way to the community center where Mrs. Thompson had helped arrange the event. Aisha was amazed by how much effort had been put into making the room inviting. Bright balloons hung from the ceiling, and tables were set up with games, snacks, and drinks. As they entered, Mrs. Thompson waved excitedly from across the room. "You two made it just in time. Everything looks fantastic." Aisha beamed with pride. "It's all thanks to you for helping us organize it." More elderly residents began to arrive, many of them smiling and chatting as they entered. Aisha and Jamal greeted everyone warmly. "Welcome. We're so glad you could join us," Aisha said, her heart swelling with happiness. Once everyone had settled in, Mrs. Thompson gathered everyone around. "Thank you all for coming today. Aisha and Jamal have planned a wonderful afternoon filled with fun and games. Let's get started." Aisha looked around the room. The residents were smiling, their faces glowing with excitement. She felt a sense of accomplishment. This was exactly what she had hoped for. The games began, and laughter filled the air. Aisha and Jamal moved from table to table, helping everyone play their favorite games. They played cards, bingo, and board games, sharing stories and laughter. Aisha watched as one woman taught another how to play a new game. "Look at them," Jamal said, grinning. "They're having so much fun." Aisha nodded, her heart soaring. "This is amazing. I'm so glad we did this." As the afternoon went on, the joy in the room grew. Aisha noticed Mrs. Thompson laughing heartily with her friends. It warmed her heart to see the elderly residents enjoying themselves so much. This was a community gathering, and they were all part of it. Then, just as they were about to start a round of bingo, something unexpected happened. The lights flickered, and then, without warning, the power went out. The room fell silent, and Aisha felt a wave of panic wash over her. "Is everyone okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course, just a little darkness," Mrs. Thompson called out, trying to lighten the mood. "We can still have fun without the lights." Aisha thought quickly. "Let's keep playing bingo. We can use flashlights." Jamal rushed to gather the flashlights they had brought along for emergencies. As he distributed them, Aisha saw the residents begin to smile again. The dim light created a cozy atmosphere, and soon laughter and chatter filled the room once more. They played bingo under the flickering flashlights, and Aisha felt a sense of unity among everyone. It didn't matter that the lights were out. They were all together, sharing in the fun. As they called out numbers, Mrs. Thompson won the first round, her face lighting up with joy. "I've never been so happy to win," she exclaimed, holding her prize high. The room erupted in laughter and cheers, and Aisha felt a deep sense of belonging. After a few more rounds of bingo, the power finally came back on, and the lights flickered back to life. The residents cheered, But Aisha noticed something important. The unexpected turn of events had brought everyone closer together. They had created memories not just through games, but through the way they handled a little mishap with laughter and joy. As the event came to a close, Aisha stood back and watched the residents say their goodbyes. They were leaving with smiles on their faces, some even asking when the next game day would be. Aisha's heart swelled with pride. They had not only entertained the elderly, but had also brought a spark of joy into their lives. Before they left, Mrs. Thompson pulled Aisha and Jamal aside. "Thank you both for making this day so special. You have no idea how much this means to us. You're true heroes in our community." Aisha felt a rush of warmth at her words. "We just wanted to help. Thank you for being part of it, Mrs. Thompson. We couldn't have done it without you." As they walked home, Aisha turned to Jamal, her face glowing with excitement. "Today was incredible. We have to do this again." "Absolutely," Jamal agreed, his eyes shining. "I can't wait to see what we'll do next." Aisha couldn't stop smiling. She felt as if they had started something beautiful, something that could change lives. The game day was not just an event. It was the beginning of a journey filled with kindness, friendship, and love for their community. As they reached her home, Aisha took a deep breath and smiled to herself. This was only the start. She had found her purpose, and she was ready to continue making a difference, one act of kindness at a time. New friendship blossoms. After the successful game day, Aisha felt a surge of happiness. She had discovered the joy of helping others, and the experience had inspired her to keep going. She and Jamal often talked about new ideas and ways they could bring more joy to their community. One sunny Saturday morning, Aisha had a brilliant idea. "What if we start a community garden?" Aisha suggested while they were hanging out in her backyard. "We could plant flowers and vegetables, and everyone could help take care of it." Jamal's eyes lit up. "That's awesome. A garden would be a great way for people to come together and learn about growing their own food. Plus, it would make our neighborhood beautiful." Excited by their new plan, Aisha and Jamal decided to organize a meeting at the community center to share their idea. They made flyers inviting everyone to join them and learn about the community garden. They hoped to gather interested neighbors, especially those who had gardening experience. The day of the meeting arrived, and Aisha felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She wanted their idea to be a success. As she and Jamal set up the room, they placed chairs in a circle and prepared materials to explain their vision. When the meeting started, Aisha stood in front of the small group that had gathered. There were a few elderly neighbors, young families, and even some children eager to help. Aisha took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for coming. Today, we want to talk about starting a community garden. It will be a place where we can grow flowers and vegetables together." The group listened intently as Aisha explained how the garden could benefit everyone. "We can learn about gardening, share our knowledge, and have fun while making our neighborhood beautiful. Plus, we can enjoy fresh vegetables." After she finished, Jamal chimed in. "And we can create a space where everyone can come together, meet new friends, and enjoy the outdoors." One of the elderly neighbors, Mr. Jenkins, raised his hand. "I love the idea. I used to have a garden in my backyard, and I would be happy to help teach others how to grow their own plants." "That's fantastic," Aisha exclaimed. "Your experience will be invaluable." As the meeting continued, more neighbors expressed their excitement. They discussed what to plant, how to design the garden, and how to involve the children. The energy in the room was electric, and Aisha felt the thrill of possibility. After the meeting, the group decided to meet every weekend to start planning and preparing the garden. Aisha and Jamal couldn't wait to get started. They organized a cleanup day to clear a space in the local park for the garden. They put out a call for volunteers, and soon a small army of neighbors showed up, ready to lend a hand. On the cleanup day, Aisha looked around and felt a sense of pride. The park was buzzing with activity. People were chatting, laughing, and working together. Aisha helped direct the volunteers as they picked up trash, cleared weeds, and prepared the area for planting. Mrs. Thompson was there too, cheering everyone on. "You young folks are doing such a wonderful job. I'm so proud of you," she said, clapping her hands. With each passing hour, the area transformed. The volunteers worked tirelessly, fueled by excitement and teamwork. Aisha felt a sense of fulfillment as she watched everyone come together for a common goal. After the cleanup, it was time to plant the first seeds. Aisha and Jamal had gathered various seeds from the local store: tomatoes, peppers, and colorful flowers. They explained to everyone how to plant the seeds, and soon everyone was digging, planting, and watering. The sun shone brightly as laughter filled the air. Aisha noticed how much joy the garden brought to everyone. It was more than just a place to grow plants. It was becoming a gathering spot for the community. As the weeks passed, the garden began to flourish. Aisha and Jamal visited regularly, checking on the plants and helping neighbors learn how to care for them. They organized gardening days where everyone could come together to work on the garden, share tips, and enjoy each other's company. One day, while working in the garden, Aisha spotted a little girl sitting on a bench nearby, watching them. She looked shy and unsure. Aisha decided to go over and introduce herself. "Hi there, I'm Aisha. Would you like to help us with the garden?" she asked gently. The little girl looked up, her eyes wide. "I don't know how to garden," she whispered. "That's okay. We're all learning together. It's really fun, and I promise you'll have a great time," Aisha replied, her voice warm and inviting. After a moment, the girl smiled shyly and nodded. "Okay, I'll try." Aisha led her back to the garden, introducing her to Jamal and the other volunteers. "This is Mia. She's going to help us today." Mia's face lit up as the group welcomed her with open arms. They showed her how to plant seeds, water the plants, and even how to pull weeds. Aisha could see the joy building in Mia as she learned and participated. As the day went on, Aisha noticed that Mia was becoming more confident and outgoing. By the end of the day, she was laughing and chatting with the other kids, completely immersed in the garden activities. After they finished planting for the day, Aisha turned to Mia. "You did an amazing job today. Do you want to come back next week?" Mia's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Yes, I would love to." Aisha felt a warmth spread through her heart. It was moments like these that made all the hard work worth it. She knew they were not just growing plants. They were nurturing friendships and building a strong community. As they cleaned up and headed home, Aisha reflected on how much the garden had changed not only the park, but also the lives of everyone involved. She was filled with gratitude for the journey she had embarked on with her friends and neighbors. Every seed planted in the garden was a seed of kindness, hope, and connection. Aisha couldn't wait to see what would blossom next. She knew that with each act of kindness, they were creating a beautiful future together, one that would continue to grow and thrive in their community. A life-changing gift. As the community garden continued to flourish, Aisha and Jamal felt an incredible sense of pride. The plants grew tall and vibrant, and the garden became a place of joy, laughter, and connection. They often hosted weekend events where neighbors gathered to share stories, learn about gardening, and enjoy fresh produce. It was amazing to see how the garden had transformed the community. One sunny Saturday, while working in the garden, Aisha noticed something unusual. An elderly woman named Mrs. Davis, who often walked by, had stopped to watch. Aisha could see a look of curiosity on her face. Aisha decided to approach her. "Hi, Mrs. Davis. Would you like to join us?" Aisha asked with a warm smile. "We're planting some new flowers today." Mrs. Davis looked surprised but pleased. "Oh, I'd always wanted to plant flowers. I just never had the time or energy. You kids have done a wonderful job here. We'd love your help," Aisha said enthusiastically. "It's easy, and we're all learning together." Mrs. Davis nodded and slowly walked over to join them. Aisha felt happy to see her engage with the garden. She could tell that Mrs. Davis had a lot of wisdom and experience to share. As they worked together, Mrs. Davis shared stories about her own garden from when she was a young girl. She spoke fondly of the flowers she used to grow and the joy they brought her family. Aisha listened closely, soaking up every word. "This garden brings back so many memories," Mrs. Davis said, her eyes twinkling. "It's wonderful to see the community come together like this." Aisha smiled. "It means so much to us to have you here. You've inspired us with your stories." That day, as they planted flowers together, Aisha noticed a special bond forming between Mrs. Davis and the other volunteers. Everyone began to gather around, eager to hear her stories and learn from her experiences. The garden was becoming a bridge between generations. As the weeks passed, Aisha realized that the community garden was not just a place to grow plants. It was a space where friendships blossomed. People from all walks of life came together, sharing their knowledge, laughter, and love. Aisha felt grateful for the connections being formed around her. One day, while working in the garden, Jamal approached Aisha with an idea. "What if we hold a harvest festival? We could celebrate everything we've grown and invite the whole neighborhood." Aisha's eyes lit up. "That's a fantastic idea. We can have games, food, and share our harvest with everyone." The two friends quickly began planning the festival. They put up flyers in the neighborhood, inviting everyone to join them for a day of fun and celebration. They encouraged neighbors to bring dishes made from the vegetables they had grown in the garden. On the day of the harvest festival, the sun shone brightly, and the garden was filled with laughter and excitement. Aisha and Jamal were busy setting up tables, arranging decorations, and preparing games for the children. As guests started to arrive, the atmosphere buzzed with joy. Families brought delicious dishes made with fresh vegetables from the garden. There were salads, stews, and even a variety of homemade desserts. Aisha was amazed to see so many people coming together to celebrate their hard work. As the festival kicked off, Aisha felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. The garden had become a symbol of hope and community. She watched as neighbors mingled, children played games, and laughter filled the air. Mrs. Davis set up a booth where she taught children how to make flower crowns using blooms from the garden. The kids giggled as they crafted their crowns, proudly wearing them as they danced around. Aisha and Jamal ran a game booth where children could play fun challenges to win small prizes. The excitement in the air was contagious, and even the adults joined in on the fun. As the day went on, Aisha noticed a group of neighbors gathered around the table filled with fresh produce. They were excitedly discussing ways to use the vegetables in new recipes. Aisha felt a sense of pride, knowing that the garden was not only nourishing their bodies, but also fostering creativity and connection. As the sun began to set, Aisha and Jamal gathered everyone for a final celebration. They stood on a small stage made of wooden crates and thanked everyone for being part of the community garden. "Thank you all for your hard work, dedication, and love for this garden," Aisha exclaimed. "Together, we've created something beautiful." The crowd erupted in applause, and Aisha felt tears of joy welling up in her eyes. She looked around at the smiling faces of her friends, neighbors, and the community that had come together. Then Mrs. Davis stood up, her voice strong and clear. "I want to thank you, Aisha and Jamal, for bringing us all together. This garden has changed our lives and reminded us of the beauty of community." Aisha felt her heart swell with gratitude. She realized that this garden had become a place of healing and connection for everyone involved. As the festival came to a close, Aisha looked around, filled with warmth and love. She had learned that even the smallest seeds could grow into something incredible when nurtured with care and kindness. In that moment, Aisha understood that the garden was more than just a place to grow flowers and vegetables. It was a sanctuary of friendship, hope, and shared memories. She felt grateful for the journey they had taken together and excited for the future that lay ahead. From that day on, Aisha and Jamal continued to nurture the garden and their community. They knew that as long as they worked together, they could create a space where love and kindness would always bloom.